Women Making Moves, where we celebrate the moves that women are making. My name is Amy Pons. I'm a Master Certified Life Coach and an energy healer. I'm joined today with Isis Fabian. Isis is a researcher, educator, and coach whose decade-long background in nationally representative research and consulting spans race, ethnicity, disability, gender identity, neurodiversity, implicit bias, allyship, and more. Through workshops, facilitated dialogues, and advisory, Isis supports organizations and individuals by demystifying diversity and allyship, teaching effective communication across identities and cultures, and building self-awareness for historically advantaged groups like white people, men, and non-disabled people to break out of the colonial and imperial thought patterns, restricting our access to collective liberation. Isis's own experience being neurodivergent and agender deeply informs their work. Isis, welcome.
Thank you. Oh, that was a mouthful.
No, I don't read bios beforehand on purpose because I like to have a fresh set of eyes on what I'm learning about the person I'm about to talk to. Well, what that looks like sometimes is that I haven't practiced at all. And it's the first time I'm reading it, of course. And so it's a fun little challenge I give myself. How awesome is it? We're talking on full moon.
I know, right?
We were supposed to talk a while ago, right?
Yeah. And then I think it was losing my cat. And then there was something else that happened a week or two ago, like whatever it was. Yeah. We moved it 2 times.
And so here we are on pink full moon in Scorpio, which is awesome
Yeah.
because we're both extremely enlightened and attuned and awake. So
Try to be. It's a humbling journey, right? It's like the more you know, the less you know.
yeah, some days I'm like trucking along. I'm like, wow. And then something will just like, I always tell my husband this, things will always be put in our pathways to both show us how far we've come, but also to give us a clear line of sight about where we may still want to go. And so that's always fun for me. Like this week, someone approached me about doing some marketing work. And, you know, having been in corporate marketing for 20 years, I can do it.
Right.
And do I want to? So I thought it was I'm like, thanks, guides. Thank you for setting this in my pathway because it's a decision I get to intentionally make. And it's not just about following the money anymore. It's like,
Right.
Do I want to do this? And the answer is no. So I'm like, okay, then that's that, you know, so it's pretty beautiful.
Congrats on getting
Thanks.
to that place where you can see that so clearly.
Thank you. It took me a minute. Because I made a post on LinkedIn about this the other day. I beautifully manifested signing no new clients in April because we're in Mercury retrograde and there can be contract miscommunication and all of that. Well, it worked. So I was like, oh, awesome. And I need to I would like to lift that. I mean, of course, Mercury retrograde ends this week. So
Finally.
I'm hoping that lifts the veil for new clients to be ushered back in, but of course that worked. So anyway, I could have easily been like, lack scarcity fear and taken it, but I trust myself and I trust my guides and I trust the pathway that when this lifts, that the beautiful individuals that I'm calling in will find me once again and we'll be okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I started off Mercury retrograde period. April 1st is when I lost my cat so suddenly and surprisingly, our young cat. And it really, I mean, there's so many things that come with grief, right? But I think one of the biggest awakenings for me in that moment was, oh my gosh, like, because he was, you know, sick for like a week or two, and then it happened, and he had become my fixation, right? But prior to him getting sick, you know, I was fixated on some other thing, some other client or whatever that wasn't going the way I wanted it to, all the stuff that was outside my control, you know, thinking about where do I step in, where do I go above and beyond, but also not do that because I have this pattern of taking over and like smoothing over the gaps to make things easier and simpler for myself in the short term, but then becoming overly committed in the long term and just constantly, you know, running that program in my head, total waste of energy, right? And then it wasn't until my cat got sick that I suddenly didn't care about that anymore. Yeah. And then when I'm greeting my cat, and then that's all I care about, but then I have my baby shower like a few days later, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, suddenly just became so aware of how much I had to be grateful for that I spent no mental energy on at all. And it was so real. Losing my cat was very real. The grief that came with that, I'm like, this is real. All this other, anything else that has been, a negative, so to speak, thing in my mind for going however far back in the past hasn't been real. At one point our baby was in breach and I didn't even care because the cat was so sick, and then the baby flipped over. The next time we saw, our midwives a few days after we lost our cat and the baby had flipped over all by himself, just casually, I was like, in a different universe, I was just like thinking about that constantly and trying to do all the stuff to flip him over. And, it's just very humbling to realize how much agency we have over our own thought patterns and the things that we put, mental energy into. And now I'm looking out the window at all these cherry blossom trees and the green grass and the little cherry blossom, petals just flying all over the place. And everything is just so lush and green. All these trees blooming. I'm like, what a miracle to be able to sit here talking to you, looking at all of this beautiful nature and the sunshine. And we don't have a sky full of smoke right now, right? Like there's just countless things.
Yeah.
And I'm really working now, more than ever on holding that, front of mind. I spent the weekend at a monastery that my mom in the order my mom was ordained with, and that really helped ground me in that. So feeling good for the first time in a few weeks.
And we've talked in the past, so I feel comfortable asking you this question. Do you feel that your cat, part of its purpose or mission was to shift that energy for you?
I do. But then I also feel like weirdly egocentric when I have those thoughts, right? I'm trying to work through that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's
like he was on his own life story and he had his own reasons for being a cat at that time and, and coming to be with us and all of that. And at the same time, in the days following his death, whenever I would start ruminating specifically on the idea that his life force was now absent from my physical reality, I would get kicked by the baby.
They're working together.
Right? I was like, and then the message I got from it was, he was literally like, I'm right here. And it wasn't like my cat saying, I'm right here. It was like life force itself saying, I'm right here. You're over here thinking this like lack-based, thought about life force. And I'm right here, like inside of you. Like, what are you talking about? It happened so many times. It was really incredible.
So that's amazing. Those are the types of things, Isis, that I feel so many people, especially there's certainly a lot more like us that trust those glimmers or those little things that happen. You're like, oh, okay. Like my dogs wink at me and that's their way of saying like, hi, and I know that for a fact. And so it's easy to, as we're adults, just kind of brush that off. It's like, oh, it's just my imagination or it's just a coincidence. No, it's not, everybody. No, it's not. And how beautiful. I hear you on not wanting to think about how your cat gave its life for you to be able to shift energy. And I'll share a similar story, not a pet, but when I was experiencing my first big awakening in 23, I was starting to tap back inward and understand nature and realize how powerful I am. And I walked outside one morning and a bird was dead on our back deck. And I was like, oh, and I had this very human moment where like, did I do that? Did I kill that bird? And I immediately got on the phone with my spirit coach and she was like, did you kill that bird? I was like, no. She was like, of course not. And how beautiful that the bird, it gave its life to show you how powerful you are and to validate how one you are with nature and to welcome you back home. She was like, how gorgeous. And also she's like, the only thing that bird was here to do was to do that in this life. So it's like wild to think about. And the same thing for your cat. Yes, he came here to be a cat but also this was part of his story, to be able to help you through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And he left, before we'd spent thousands of dollars on these medical interventions and put him through, God knows, all kinds of things he didn't want to be put through before our baby shower, before the baby was here. If the baby was here and this happened, we never would have forgiven ourselves. We would have said, oh my God, we were just focused on the baby. We totally neglected him. We totally forgot about him, right? Instead, he was like our singular focus, and that still didn't, stop the inevitable. And that bird story is interesting because I actually had an almost identical experience when I was really questioning the relationships I had when I was still in the 9-to-5 world. I had this long-term plan to leave and work for myself, but I did not have yet the conviction and the confidence to just take that leap. And I was starting to allow those feelings about my manager and like the lack of alignment just with, energetic alignment and values-based alignment, right? Because I'd had really horrible, mean managers before. It wasn't that kind of situation, but it was like, we just are not aligned from a values standpoint. And the whole situation I was in, and it was like, I was finally allowing myself to start to call it into question. And then I found right outside my back door, which is not a glass door. It's just a little screen door and a little side thing. And there's this big bird that was just dead right outside the door. And my feelings were just like, it was a mourning, right? Because I'm like, oh my God, it was like a manifestation of the mourning of, yep, let's mourn this. Yep. It's time to grieve. Something has died. Something is dying. And this is the pivot point where you really need to witness and accept that and like take the responsive action that is aligned.
Amazing. I wish we would have known each other, but of course we weren't supposed to at that time. I walked out, I was like, I had a panic. I was like, I watched too many movies. Is that an omen? Is all this?
Right.
So I gathered the bird and I went to a tree and I gave a little service and ceremony for it, a memorial, thanking Gaia, thanking my guides. And at that point, I was 6 months out of my 9-to-5, my corporate job. And so that bird beautifully represented the death and rebirth of my professional, not just my professional, but like my whole purpose of being, and how related, how connected to nature I was coming back to. It was so beautiful. And that's why like everything is so rooted. I go by cycles of the moon. I'm so excited for full moon tonight. I go to a ceremony each month, and for new moon and full moon, I'm so excited. I love tapping back into nature. Already knows. Nature knows how to do life, soup to nuts, and we try to over-engineer it. And then nature will beautifully show us a signal that says, hey there, remember? And for you and me that can hear those, we're like, oh, right. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. That's what's been so incredible about growing a child, because I'm like, with literally zero intellectual input from me or any egoic input of any kind, my body has created a skeleton and a brain and a heart, just like totally on its own. Like, you would mess this up if you were involved, frankly. I can't do anything to improve or facilitate, upon what is naturally happening. And like that natural intelligence that is totally non-intellectual and non-Western knowledge based in the way that we understand knowledge and understand knowing. It's very humbling, right? To be like, oh, you spend your whole life with this hyper intellectualized conception of power and capability and all of that. And under, patriarchy, it really makes you think about that too. I'm like, oh my God, if I were a man and there were women who could do this thing, like do this alchemy in their bodies to make people. That's the other thing I've been thinking recently. Like, we always talk about making babies and having a baby. I'm like, how about making people? That's what we're doing. Like, this is where people come from. Yeah. Like making a whole person, right? I would be so scared. I mean, under our current paradigm, right? I'd be so scared and so intimidated and frightened by this capacity. Of course, you're going to totally try to control that group of people, control that means of production. I mean, try to control every other means of production. This is probably the most important one there is. But I would feel such a sense of impotence too, and inadequacy, like not being capable as a man. I know there's a lot of women who also can't have kids for all kinds of reasons, and a lot who choose not to, but it's like the divinity of our very anatomy that is designed around that, that on its own, I think is so much more powerful than a lot of us really think about.
Yeah, we're literally magic, and the patriarchy doesn't have room for magic. It's about the power structure order, and anything that is something you can't see or touch or feel, that's not safe. And that's, of course, how we've gotten into this place of so deep rooted in the patriarchy, late stage capitalism, white supremacy. We're in this place where, let's take it back 100 years ago, the world was only designed by white men for white men to benefit other white men. And anything outside of that, they don't really know what to do with, which is what we're ushering in. We're saying, oh, how beautiful is it that not only can we trust inward, but also the way Mother Earth is operating. And oh, by the way, we're giving the pathway, we're building the runway, women especially, to consider there's more than one way to achieve something, and coming back into the feeling, knowing, trusting of the divine feminine to be able to create that balance that we've never had. I'm not about pointing fingers. I'm going to point fingers at the systems. Those are broken. But the humans behind it, like, it's almost like getting in front of them and saying, help me understand what would help feel safe right now. What makes you feel unsafe about the indigenous innate nature, power, magic of women who hold our entire life force, life and death in our womb space. And every month, for those who menstruate, for me personally, what I do is I give what doesn't serve me, that energy, I put that into my womb space so that when I menstruate, I shed it and it beautifully flows out of me. Like that is the magic. And to your point, growing a human, we are magic. And it's not from a place of ego. It's from a place on the soul plane where like, that's what we're here to do. Women, we're on the forefront, and it's not gender. It's the divine feminine is on the forefront of ushering in this balance and this change, leveraging our own unique brilliance and spirit that we've always had inside of us. I go back to it's indigenous. It's in us.
And I think when we get into the kind of psychic cognitive side of it, there are men, right, cisgendered men who are expressing the divine feminine, but it's being so suppressed by men and women around them.
Oh yeah.
Right?
That's why it's not about gender.
Right.
Divine feminine, divine masculine.
It's like that creative, potentiated capacity. And then there's women, and this is what I see, coming from the diversity and inclusion world, like white women in particular, so double down, right? So bought into the patriarchal behaviors, the colonial behaviors, the imperial behaviors, the white supremacy behaviors. And this is one of many issues with what that industry has kind of perpetuated is the tokenism, right? Like, oh, if we just get the rainbow of people on our company page, then we've succeeded. When in reality, and this is like kind of the elephant in the room that I've heard more and more people talk to me about in one-on-ones, but they won't kind of say publicly, is like at these companies, if you have like a bunch of white men and one white woman on the executive team, she often has some of the worst employee data in terms of engagement, psychological safety. You might have the biggest gender gaps in terms of what the people on their team are experiencing. And that's because that woman has had to prove that she is more ruthless, more, heartless, less human-centric to get to that place than men have. And that's the case for people from any historically marginalized, racial or ethnic group. So it's weird for me because coming from like the diversity and inclusion background, coming from the belly of the beast on this front, I don't want to be perceived as like a DEI person, because I think that there's so much that needs to change. And to what you were saying earlier about these systems being designed by and for certain groups, right? Like the concept of diversity and inclusion, it perpetuates this fantasy that we are somehow going to insert at all levels of those systems people who have historically existed at the margins of those systems, when in reality, for that system to continue operating the way it has to continue marginalizing those people. That's part of how the system functions. It marginalizes difference. It homogenizes. It rewards that sameness. It rewards that kind of log rolling exchange, tit for tat, quid pro quo. It has to have that central homogenous, patriarchal white supremacist core to keep operating the way that these systems have. And they're not broken. We're just seeing them for kind of what they are and how they've always operated. So coming from that awareness, much more focused on dismantling the imperialism and all that, but it is in our own minds. These are things that we perpetuate through our own behavior, through our own self-talk, through our own, I like the example I was giving earlier, right? Where I'm still focused on like, well, what are the things that aren't going right and what needs to get done, right? It's like this focus on perfectionism and on productivity and on scarcity, right? These systems are where we've inherited those constructs from, and they live inside us.
If I may, you are a radical inclusivist. I just made that up. But is that fair to say?
I guess. I challenge the concept of inclusion with expansion wherever I can.
You're a radical expansionist.
But then that's just meaningless. At that point, it's just a meaningless. So inclusivist maybe makes more sense.
Either one, but what I mean by that is, and you hit on so many things, like psychological safety is my jam. That's my entire purpose of being here on this plane, is offering, and that's why it gets interesting with people, because I'm also an intersectional feminist and activist. So when someone says something egregious to me, like I want to hold safe space without my sacred rage like boiling over, and so it's an interesting crossroads that I meet at any given time. But psychological safety, to your point, I'm just going to go to the workplace really quickly. By and large, the workplaces, again, were created 100 years ago, industrial age. And if you think about back then, who was in the workforce? It was all white men. So again, we're talking about the colonialism, white patriarchy, white supremacy, everything. It was all there. It was that's what was created to be safe. And to your point, I saw this like literally every day in my corporate job, in my corporate world. Really well-intentioned leaders, we would all be on the director level and we would be like, all right, when we get there, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. Well, the hard truth to your point is that you get promoted by perpetuating more of what of the systems. Again, the
Right.
systems in place were developed 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, and those are still operating that way. Those
Yeah.
systems, those operations in place, those processes that are put in place, those would take millions of dollars to completely upheave and rebuild. Not impossible, but it takes a lot of effort and money. If you feel called a recent episode with Amina Chaudhry, I would say she's also a radical expansionist. It's a new title. She talks about the system specifically. She was like, we can put all the people that we want to in these places. They will inevitably fail without these systems being put in place because they get there and they quickly see that they're like, oh, I can't change this. Also, I will have a target on my back. And so they conform to the perpetuating of more of the same or the copy paste culture. I want to think they were well intentioned and they get there like, oh shoot, I can't do that. And I was one of those. Like when I got into that role, and that's a big part of why I said today's my last day, because I realized I had changed. I was not harming, and I was also perpetuating the problem. I'd gotten there, I'm like, I'm going to change the world. And it was like, oh, no, you're not. Sit down, little girl. It was very quickly the vibe. So
Yeah.
love what you just said. And that's absolutely where we're at. The reason I love the word radical, it's not just about these same people being in charge, slapping an initiative on DEI and saying, okay, go. Not that.
Yeah.
It is radical in the fact that like we need to go fuck shit up for us to actually dismantle. It's not just about keeping going or like applying something to what we already have. It's not that.
Yeah. And as white people, it's not, abandoning the other white people to go join, everyone else. It's calling in. We have to do the grunt work of calling in the other white people, calling in, white
Yes.
men. Because I had a fascinating interview with an executive many years ago who's at a massive tech company, very well known. And he had just, at a certain point in his career, he was so happy with the team he had assembled that and this is someone who was part of the dominant group, right? So he didn't have to like play all of this politics, or he wasn't under the microscope the way, a woman would be, right? And he decided to just give his direct reports carte blanche to make decisions, do whatever they wanted. He's like, you're all super qualified running the verticals you're running. If you need help or you need advice, come to me. If something goes wrong, blame it on me. If something goes right, you take credit. Let's see how this goes, right?
Awesome.
He literally doubled, profit in his line in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And he was so excited about it because he was like, wow, like this was so successful. And he was invited, to speak at their annual conference and like speak on what he did. He's like, I'm really excited to share because it was like so easy. And he goes and he gets, you could hear a pin drop when he explains this to this space. It's just like crickets. It was the last thing anybody wanted to hear. And he left that company shortly after I spoke to him. He was so sad to find that like there's no desire to give up power, which is essentially what happened there, right? To give up that hierarchy. I mean, that's kind of what I bring a lot of my work back to, is these concepts of hierarchy. Anywhere that there's a hierarchy, anywhere, even when we say, oh, I'm more enlightened than that person, so I'm superior to them, that's a hierarchy, right? We look at someone else's grocery cart and say, wow, like they eat a lot of junk food. That's a hierarchy, right? When we like judge someone's hair, that's a higher, like there's a million different ways that we do it. And we're so, again, accustomed to and acculturated by these systems to constantly be putting ourselves in hierarchies with each other. And by doing that, we perpetuate those systems and we don't even realize or take accountability for the fact that we're doing that. But it will take, men, it will take the people at the absolute epicenters of these systems who no one would suspect, who no one is holding up a magnifying glass to, making these kinds of, I don't like to say human-centered decisions, because then that excludes like all the other more than human beings that are not human, but in these human systems, right? Them making those choices, and they need to be given permission to feel their feelings, right? Yeah. To express their needs. Like I've talked to so many millennial men, for instance, who work at these companies that now have pretty generous paternity leave policies, but they won't take them, even though they really, really want to, because they genuinely want to spend that time with their, newborn. But it's because there's implicit and sometimes explicit pressure from older men. Yeah. Like, why would you want to hang out with a baby? Like, I only got 2 weeks and I only took a week of it and I was totally fine, and blah, 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 because these older men have not processed the trauma of that experience, and that they now have adult children who they have no real relationship with, who only has a relationship with their mother, if either of them. Millennials are leading the charge and going no contact with their parents also. But these men, instead of processing that wound and processing like, oh my gosh, like I actually missed out on something so critical by not being there for my children's childhood, and I can't get that back. Like I literally can't, there's no solving that. That's again another acculturation
Yeah.
we have, right? We will not admit to a problem if we do not already believe there is a solution. So we won't even acknowledge that the problem exists. And so they're blowing that pain out on the next generation of men who are ready to be the cycle breakers, but they can't because they're still being restricted by that older generation that's inflicting their own trauma on them.
Isis, here's what I want to do. You and me, we're going to go into corporations and follow these men around as their personal coach. Like I think about, people ask me, they're like, Amy, how would you possibly change this? Because the people that are perpetuating the harm the most, like the white men you're talking, or the older men that you're talking about, they're the ones that will never ask for help or like hire a coach or do any of those things.
Right.
And like, so I want it to be like a mandated coaching program where like I would literally shadow him around all day and be like, okay, I would take him aside and be like, help me understand what makes you feel unsafe right now. And we'd have like a mini session. And then when he meets those men that are like, I want to take paternity leave, he's like, how amazing for you. Please do. I didn't get that time. How gorgeous is it that you do have that? Awesome. Right. To lift them up and to not perpetuate the toxic masculine is what they think is paying your dues. No. So the radical part is what you and I are out here doing in different ways. So many similar people like us, and we all do it differently. No one can do what you do like I do. It's, we're our own superpowers and unique brilliance. But I love having this conversation where you just get it. And we know as we're out there on the forefront, meeting with people all the time, we can share this message and have the audacity to help people feel like they can change it. And I don't want to just say it's like boomers just need to retire. I'm not from that vibe either, because it's like I feel that from the big four generations right now in the workplace, especially, everyone has something to learn from each other. So it's like, hey, boomers, I want to help them feel safe, like quickly, so that they can impart some really cool info and knowledge before they depart the workplace. So,
and I will say, I met one like Gen X mid-level executive, and he said to me, I had been referred to him because I was working within this organization, and so many people had said he is the best person to work for if you're going to go on leave as a mother or a father. And I was like, why is everyone saying this? And so I talked to him, and the first thing he said to me was, I only got 2 weeks of paternity leave with my first child, and it is the single worst thing that anyone has ever done to me in my entire life. He's like, that my company doing that to me is the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life, that I was only there for 2 weeks with my newborn child. And he was just so in tune with what that had done to him on a spiritual level, on a psychic level, on an emotional level. And then he'd gone to a different company and gotten more time with his next child, and he was even more furious because he saw what he had missed with his first child. And so that was trickling down, to everybody in his vertical. And it's possible, right? For people to make these discoveries and stand in their sovereignty and be like, this is what happened to me. This is what I experienced. My emotions about it are real, regardless of what anyone might say I should feel, right? And it's like, as women, sometimes we lean away from, especially as white women, we lean away from, especially nowadays, being any kind of emotional support for men, right? Because we have this whole differentiation and rejection and dismissal of men that's going on right now. We're like, you know what? We're so done with men. Like we're over it. We're tired of being their therapist and being like the one emotional dumping ground that they have. But at the same time, there's so much power that comes with it, because you might be the only woman in a certain man's life, the only person in a certain man's life who is capable of getting him to admit these things out loud to himself. And the transformation that's possible from that is incredible.
That's the divine feminine. When we're able to hold that space as humans, but when we're able to hold that space in a way, and this is why I say, like, I have two beautiful parts of me, like it ranges from sacred rage to love and light. And I'm getting to the point where I do hold that sacred space. I do want to hear from those men. I do want to have a conversation, especially those well-intentioned men that are like, my dream would be for an executive white man to come to me and say, I see the oppression and the perpetuation that I have had a hand in, and I want to help change that on my way out. Yes, please. Yes. Dream client. That's what I would want. Right. That's who I'd want to talk to. I just don't see a lot of that happening. So like the man that you brought up, I was like, let's do a big live event with him. Like let's have him talk about it, because that's the vibe. And so to your point, like, I'm not a man hater. I'm also like, don't come at me with some bullshit. But if you're coming to me saying like, I want help, cool. Let's do that. This has gone so fast already. We're at 45 minutes in. And I knew this would happen with you. I want to make sure to get to your important, amazing work for neurodiversity. And feel free to share anything else as it relates to what's coming up for you in the last 15 minutes. But what is the current state of neurodiversity work? We'll shift a little bit.
Yeah, so I've really gotten more deep because I'm neurodivergent and I've gotten more deeply involved in that community. And it's very exciting. I now have, these monthly office hours that I do with a bunch of neurodivergent professionals. I have more and more people finding me for neurodivergent coaching, and I do a free intro session for that. I've found that there's a real synergy with, first of all my years doing research on like corporate advancement for historically marginalized groups and figuring out what are all those unspoken rules, what is all that unspoken nonsense, right? Because for a lot of us, especially people on the autism spectrum, we're very literal. We come in and be like, oh, we're trying to solve a problem. Here's how to solve the problem. Or, oh, we're all trying to work together to make the best product. Here's how to do that. And you find you're running into brick walls and failing and getting marginalized. You go from being an A+ 5-star gold star student to being told there's something wrong with you, all these kinds of things. So it's really gratifying to be able to share that insight with people and help them see why like, nope, that email you sent to that woman, actually, here's how she's probably interpreting it, to help them not, self-sabotage inadvertently as part of it's kind of like a survival. I really see it as like corporate survival coaching rather than like, we're going to be girl boss or whatever. But the other side of it is that I find, after being in research for so long and then working inside a tech company for 3 years, so total of like a decade of experience working through these things and collecting a lot of, data about it, that these colonial, imperial, patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist, norms that kind of define professionalism and define, the haves and the have-nots and who's going to advance and who's not. All of them show up in how people across the neurodiversity spectrum are impacted in the workplace. And I'm finding there's just more of an appetite with companies right now, especially with AI, because there's this whole like movement toward nonlinear thinking and innovation and who's going to be on like the leading front of innovating with AI. You can't just keep doing business as usual, right? It'll be like Blockbuster. Right? There's just so much change happening. So there is this interest in neurodiversity, also coming from a paternalistic place. A lot of people are having their kids diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and things, and they're worried about what the workforce is going to look like for them. So I'm seeing a way in to bring up these concepts like, well, this cultural norm, that cultural norm, that cultural norm, which are actually norms of imperialism and white supremacy and everything else, are things that are barriers for people who are neurodivergent, and for bringing, more neurodiversity into your workforce and for bringing out the full potential of people who are neurodiverse. And then there's the, legal side too, right? I mean, most forms of neurodivergence are disabilities, and there's a whole set of things you don't want to mess up on as a company when it comes to accommodations and how you treat someone, because it's still very commonplace and very normalized to discriminate against people who display autistic traits, for instance, by just saying, oh, he doesn't even look at the camera during the interview, that guy's weird. We're just not going to hire him, right? So it's getting to a point where you can't safely keep, openly discriminating that way. So that's one of the reasons I'm really glad to be focused more and more on, the neurodiversity experience inside of things. Again, I don't really take like the DEI industrial complex approach to it. I'm much more seeing it as just like a strategic avenue to challenging those big structures and those big structural norms. And I'm also writing a book, which I don't know, I'm hoping to have it out by the end of the year, because I keep getting asked when I do speaking engagements if I have a book, why haven't I written a book, where can they read more? And that's really expands the aperture even more to just the modern hopelessness that a lot of people, and again, especially neurodivergent people who can see the patterns of what's happening with the meta crisis in our world right now, kind of see where the dominoes are falling and realizing like, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there's so many things I can't take for granted about the world in which I'm living. And people are really falling into despair about that and really struggling for like, how am I supposed to be okay? How am I supposed to, think about things differently? Like not realizing to what you brought up earlier, there's this whole universe of thought and spirit and everything that lies beyond these material, secular kind of very limited parameters that are set by acculturation. And so I'm writing a book all around like just all these different concepts to explore. That's not, saying, hey, come be like spiritual or religious. It's not even like that. It's like, think about this thing that you take for granted and let's pull it apart and see why it actually has no legs to stand on, and about like literally stepping outside of the box, right? This box that we're in of modern hopelessness about our world. What does it look like to step outside that box and see that box for what it is, and then see the massive universe of possibility that lies outside of it? So I'm excited about that too. Who knows? Again, I just want it to be there. When people find it or need it, like if it helps even like one person, you know, and it helps just to write stuff down. It's very gratifying. So yeah, I'd say those are the two big things for me right now.
That's amazing. I like to call it woo curious because I don't suggest that anyone, you don't have to subscribe. And I'm unabashed about my woo. I'll post everywhere on LinkedIn that I'm a witch, like things like it's just fun stuff. And you also, to work with me, you don't have to subscribe to anything that I talk about. It's just like where
Yeah.
I'm coming from. But I will encourage you to think about what is something of a higher plane that might be navigating you or dropping you breadcrumbs, whether it's God, source, creator, universe, anybody. It's like, what is that for you? We're on the human plane. So we have the 3 levels of consciousness, which is the spiritual. And again, it's not necessarily religious, but it's something, it's spiritual. We're spiritual creatures, intellect, of course, and then physical bodies. It's like understanding
Yeah.
all of that. If Mother Earth is your higher place, awesome. If you are nature science-based, amazing. Then that means, you know, Earth is your higher power. So
There's so much there. There's so much potential. Like I always tell people, my awakening started when I read a book on astrophysics.
there you
It
go.
was called The End of Everything Astrophysically Speaking by Katie Mack. And she literally, there's a part where she has to explain that like we don't know what gravity even is. Like on a fundamental level, we don't know what gravity is
Right.
or why it happens. We know the formula to calculate the, you know, force of gravity. We don't know what it is or why it happens. And it's inexplicably following this totally different set of rules compared to all the other forces, physical forces that we know of, which are so much stronger, like the nuclear force, right? I can defy gravity and pick up this water bottle. Like I shouldn't be able to defy, you know, such a large force that way. And so one of the leading theories as to why is that it is spread across the multiverse. That's why gravity is so weak in one universe, because it's the only force that's spread across the multiverse and exerted across many universes at once. And like people don't realize that there's valid scientific, you know, interrogation of these things. Not to mention, you know, you get into quantum physics and quantum entanglement and all of that. And so reading that book and learning more about quantum physics really was like the kind of humbling thing away from my agnostic hubris that I had before, where and again, this is our social Western acculturation is like science, you know, trumps everything. It's like, okay, yeah. And yet look how many religious scientists there are, because they're the ones who actually are seeing stuff that can't be explained by the existing science. And they know the limits of what science has been able to explain up until this point, whereas the rest of us think science means the things I can observe with my eyes. Meanwhile, there's nothing fundamental about that reality. There's actually no way to prove that what we observe with our eyes is any fundamental reflection of, you know, a larger reality, right? So there's just a lot of ways that we live in fantasy already. We live in, you know, if you believe in the material world that you see with your eyes, then you're already believing in like a fairy tale, right? That's how you're already on that. So you can't look at someone who's a witch or someone who communes with the spirit world or anything else and say that they're in more of a fairy tale land than you are.
No, and that's back to like what you're talking about hierarchy. It's like judging someone else. I live in a world where anything is possible. That is absolutely fact for me in the Court of Amy. And I love the idea of defying gravity. Like that's actually one of my power songs. I love that you ventured out to learn something more in that book specifically. And it's almost like I don't need evidence since I was a kid. I'm like, I know that it's not just my imagination. I know I'm not just daydreaming. I know that all of this in some other plane happened right now. I saw a pink unicorn in my head. Yeah, that's somewhere out there.
Yeah.
That's all real, you know? And as humans, we have spent the last how many millennia over engineering it, of course, to the true state it is today, where we just try to over engineer everything to what we can see or touch or feel. And I implore anyone, even the most staunch fact science-based person, I would invite them to sit with themselves and just be quiet and close their eyes and start to tell me what they see or feel. That's when the magic starts to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't wanted to see that because they're like, oh, that's hogwash. Like, that's not real. What's real is this microphone in front of me.
Right.
Is it?
I mean, I think part of it for me that I've been lucky, I guess, is I have a very strong like dreaming and lucid dreaming practice. I've been lucid dreaming since I was 7 years old. And so I will be in a dream that is exactly like this. I'll be on Zoom. I'll be, you know, at a desk, like it's literally in my house. And I'm like, and yet when we're, you know, awake, we're like, this is real. This is what's real, right? Like the way I describe it sometimes is, you know, if I'm sitting here, there's a floor, I can see the floor over there, right? I know, oh, there's a floor there. If I walk over there, I'm not going to fall into a void. But the same can be said in my dream, right? I look over, there's a floor, I can walk on there, I'm not going to fall into a void. But does that mean the floor is real? Does that mean it is a physical, stable, static object that exists whether or not I'm in the room? You actually can't prove that, right? And I think it's very, a lot of people are just like, oh, they just want to deal with like the empirical, what they see with their eyes. But again, as someone who's been lucid dreaming my whole life, I'm able to really call that into question. And I know it can be scary, I think, for a lot of us to call fundamental aspects of our reality into question, but we have to now, with where the world is going, with what is happening energetically, happening everywhere. I mean, you can see it with your eyes. I mean, if you're a very fact-based person, you can see our path to water scarcity with climate change, the desertification of food, world war, right? AI, like pick your poison. Even things, simple things, smaller things that are country based, like the boomer population aging. Like, we're not going to have people take care of them in this country. What's going to happen then? Right? A million different things. And to engage with that world in a way that you're not going to be completely dysfunctional, you have to start questioning fundamental aspects of your worldview. One thing I ask everyone to question is if you have this belief that people are inherently out to take advantage of one another, right? Because they get scared of, losing the resources. They're like, oh, I guess it's time to buy a gun. I have to protect my family. I have to protect my, food supply or whatever. And it's like, okay, you're contributing psychically to a reality in which people are operating that way. Yeah. But we don't have any evidence that people act that way. In fact, we've seen countless natural disasters, countless situations where people have done the opposite. They've been incredibly altruistic. They put their lives on the lines to save children they don't even know. That's what humans do on the whole. Right. But you're used to the paradigm that is run by the only people who would operate that way, right? Which are in the ruling class. They're a very small population. And all we can do is build relationships in our communities and start seeing people for who they actually are, the people who are immediately around us, and build resilience as a community, because it's always going to be stronger against whatever might come than we are on our own. But I implore people to recognize that our thinking, our constructs, our assumptions and predictions and expectations about the future, right? First of all, we can't predict the future. So stop being so full of yourself. And then secondly, there's so much beyond. There's so much beyond what you're imagining. And you can see it if you look back when the internet came out. Who predicted 99% of how the internet would affect our world and affect our relationships? Same with, something like social media, right? Same with phones, same with anything, any big disruption, same with AI. And it's going to be even more extreme, the changes we see from that. And so we have this like comfort we're very attached to around control and certainty of like, oh, I need to be able to predict. If I can predict it, even if it's a doomsday scenario, I feel comfortable because I think I know what's going to happen, rather than getting comfortable with having no idea. Like, no idea what's going to happen.
What's wild about that is that while we can't predict it, we can create it, which is like interesting duality. It's like, wow, okay, you can create how you would react or respond if tomorrow we lost all internet and lost all technology. Like, it was a massive worldwide blackout and you can't call anyone, suddenly the roads don't work. So it goes back to like what I see happen is that through any of the ways that you listed before, which like where our world is headed, there will be a moment where like we do have to go back to like village-based community thinking, banding together. And when we don't know, of course, how that's going to pan out, but I just watched a movie over the weekend, Leave the World Behind, Julia Roberts. That was just their life then. Like, there was just no internet, phone, anything. And they actually couldn't use any of the highways either. They couldn't drive anywhere. So it's like, okay, how do we figure this out? Back to basics. And yeah, to your point, that terrifies people that have only become to feel safe in what we know and see in this moment in time. So
yeah,
we're not speaking from fear. We're speaking from like
possibility,
openness.
Love.
Openness and possibility and love, that like the people that are getting more and more uncomfortable are the ones that only feel safe in like the old ways or things that we can only see and touch. What we're offering is that when you stop to consider there's something beyond that, you'll be shocked at how comforting it is to consider there's something beyond that. All of this other stuff that might happen in the future doesn't become so scary. It's like, oh, you got to turn inward and say, no matter what happens externally, inside, I'm okay.
Yeah.
So, Isis, where can we find you?
On TikTok at Isis_Fabian is where I'm usually the most active. Well, as long as we still have TikTok. I think the US government's working very hard to ban it right now. And then otherwise, find me on LinkedIn. Again, I'm the only Isis Fabian. or isisfabian.com. And that's where people can find my free neurodiversity coaching, intro coaching, and my free office hours for neurodivergent professionals. Subscribe to my emails and all of that. So take your pick.
Amazing. Closing remarks.
I think I've already talked your ear off, Amy. So I will leave it at that. I think we've left people with a lot to digest.
I can't wait for round 2.
Same. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Isis.